Welcome to the Ancestral Healing Summit, a free online event where you'll learn from top experts about connecting with your ancestors to heal your lineages and transform your life. Share this powerful program with your friends and family, and come join us on Facebook at The Shift Network. And now your host, Lisa Bonis.
Welcome to this session of the Ancestral Healing Summit with my guest, David Furlong. Our topic is healing your ancestral patterns. David Furlong, PhD, is an author, spiritual healer, and teacher with more than 50 years experience. His books include The Healer Within, Healing Your Ancestral Patterns, Working with Earth Energies, and Illuminating the Shadow, Transmuting the Dark Side of the Psyche. He's the founder and director of the Spirit Release Forum, which helps people understand spirit entanglement within the psyche and the steps needed to heal deep-seated trauma originating from current and past lives and from ancestral inheritance. David, thank you for joining us today. Welcome.
I'm delighted to be able to share with you today.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've poured through your website, and your work is absolutely fascinating. But I wonder, can we start out with you maybe telling us just a little bit about your life as a healer, and what is it that led you into exploring the healing of ancestral patterns?
Well, yes, it has to go back a long way, really, to my childhood, because for whatever reason, I chose to be born into a family that believed in spiritual healing. So from a very tender age, I was exposed to some concepts which really brought forward the sense that we could access into a spiritual dimension within ourselves to transform whatever's going on for us physically. So this is, it's quite unusual, really, to be brought up in that sort of environment. So from a child, I experienced different things. I had quite a lot of inner experiences, psychic experiences in different ways. And so that set a foundation within me, really, for a journey which has been very much engaged with healing throughout the whole of my life in different aspects. And of course, like any good child, when you get into your teenage years, a lot of the stuff that your parents put on you, you have to throw off and jettison and slightly adapt and change and so forth. And it was probably when I was just before I was 20, I started to get very interested in other spiritual philosophies. So I started to read up about Buddhism, and then that led me into things like theosophy and exploring something of the whole spiritual dimension of what we are from a new angle. And then again, through either guidance or chance, I met up with a group that had similar interests, really, to myself. And behind this group, there was an individual who was a wonderful medium who would channel information and guidance. So we would get other insights into what was going on. And from there, we were started to be taught other ways of approaching healing, how you could access into different qualities of healing energy. You could send this out through yourself to help balance situations within individuals and places and situations. So from there, although at the time I trained in town planning and architecture, so that was all my practical background. It seems a long time ago now, but there was this whole esoteric journey that I was on, which as a group we would come together, we would meditate, we would explore how we could develop our psychic gifts and senses, in doing things like psychometry and all of that sort of stuff. And slowly I started to really develop my awareness of and clarify some of the things within me from spiritual perspective, to be aware also of different types of spirit entities around all of that. But in this journey in relationship to healing, of course, when a person first of all comes and sits in front of you and you're bringing healing energy, you're trying to look to see what you can do to balance what's going on for them. But a certain point comes where you then begin to think, well, why are they in this space? What's gone on? What's happened? Is it where they're living? And so part of my exploration, and that came out in my book on working with earth energies, was all to do, maybe there's something about the energy of the place which is causing a problem. And that's why they got the problems they have. So what can be done then to clear and balance the energies of places? And what I began to recognize was that in fact there was like 3 primary strands of energy which seems to cause us issues and problems. One is the strand of the environment, so everything that we grow up in, where we are, the circumstances which have gone on. Obviously, if you're living in a house which was an old battlefield site, there could be quite a lot of trauma which is associated with it. So the environment was one. And then the second one was, and in that environment, of course, is all the patterns we grow up with, childhood traumas and so forth. And then the second one was to do with any past life patterns and situations which we might be carrying. So it's coming from the soul-centered part of oneself, the spiritual part of oneself. And of course, the third leg of this triangle is everything that comes down to us from our ancestors. So I'd begun to look at and explore something of these 3 modalities in trying to understand what was happening within the individual. And at different times, things would come up in my life which would make me aware of all of that. But it was quite far into the journey, I guess, probably going back into the late 1980s, when I started to think a little bit more about all of this ancestral pattern, all of this ancestral side. And as always, what occurs, in fact, one of the my spiritual teachers from this guidance which was coming through once said to me that I tended to make things hard on myself, and I'd chosen to be born into a family which had quite a lot of issues and problems. And at the time, I knew very little about my ancestry as such. So I took on board and I thought, well, I can't think that my upbringing was any more traumatic than the people around me. I mean, so what was going on here? Well, one of the problems that I'd had was my maternal mother had died when I was about 10, so I had to deal with that trauma. But my father remarried, and my stepmother is a lovely woman, still alive, but she was very interested in family patterns, family history. So I asked her in the 1980s, would she go do some research? And of course, this is way before computers were on the go. So, but she started to research into my family, and I suddenly discovered when I went back into my grandparents' generation, that was a whole series of issues and traumas which I hadn't really taken on board. My father was alive at the time, but what I discovered was actually he did not know who his father was. So there was no record that we could find of who his father might have been. And even today, we've not yet fully resolved that. So that was a whole difficult issue that he was carrying. And secondly, I began to be aware from my mother's side that there was a whole series of problems there, that my grandfather, bless his cotton socks, had managed to run 2 families synchronistically together. So this was a whole big surprise. And at the time, I was also running, I had an I had a training group where we used to meet once a month to come together. There was about a dozen of us. and it seemed to me when I was discovering all these things about my family, it would be a good idea for us as a group to start to explore things about their families. So we sort of started on this journey together of looking and exploring. Well, in relationship to my grandfather, I mean, he had died back in about 1928, so it was quite far back. But I discovered that I had a whole series of second cousins, which I just never knew about. Well, to say second cousin, technically it'd be first cousins once removed. But I then thought, well, it would be a wonderful idea if we could try and connect up with some of these individuals, which is what we did. He had run synchronistically with being married to my grandmother, a whole other family of there were 4 of his children on the legitimate side, so to speak. That's the right way of putting it. Probably not quite so, we need to be aware of what was legitimate and illegitimate. But on the other side of the family, there were 7 children. So he had 11 children, all synchronistically tied in together. So they were all interwoven together. And even some of the names on one side of the family were the same on the other side of the family. So it was incredibly confusing. But he had a job. He was one of the early people to get into bookmaking, so he'd made quite a bit of money through running his bookmaking business. So he was able to support both families quite well. But I managed to make contact with someone from this other side of the family, and we ultimately ended up in having a big cousins reunion, where there were about 60 of us gathered together. So, and that's been an amazing thing, because suddenly finding I've got a whole group of other cousins that we spend time with, we share, and we've actually started to expand out and connect into others as well. It gives you a sense of real connection and linkage, really. And out of it all, I think there was a lot of work we did. Interestingly enough, when I first made that connection, all of my grandfather's children had passed away. So it was as though we needed to come down to the next generation in order for us to begin to heal and clear up, some of the pain which has gone on for us. So part of my journey since then, so it's the 1990s, has been exploring into my family tree and the research which I've done into that. But and of course, with hugely helped now with things like DNA and the organizations like Ancestry.com and so forth, where you can do so much of this online. I mean, when my stepmother was doing it, she had to go and visit the records offices directly, so it was a whole different process. So lots of new things have come to the light, but in the context of the group which we all suddenly recognized that there's a fantastic power held in all of this ancestral side, and people had amazing insights into what was going on within them in the connection to traumas, in some cases, which had come down in all sorts of different ways. And we sort of developed between us as a group different insights as to what would be helpful, different types of exercises which we could do to help clear up some of these blockages. And from all our points of view, that was enormously beneficial. And that really led me to writing my book, which came out in the late 1990s. So it was originally under the title of Healing Your Family Patterns, but subsequently it's got republished as Healing Your Ancestral Patterns. But it was so that's really been my journey. And when I'm working with clients at the moment, from time to time, it gets focused quite heavily into dealing with ancestral trauma at different levels. And the positive sides that come out of it, of course, is the, we're the product also of very successful ancestors. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. So there's a positive energy which comes in, but we also need to recognize and acknowledge that some of the difficulties, the negative bits. So that's the background. I hope that sets the scene.
Yeah, I didn't realize that your work went so very far back. So you're really a pioneer in this work. I remember my mom doing genealogy research back in the day when you have to actually go to the library and hope that they've got the records. And so well done you on being able to get this far without Ancestry.com and all of the online sites. So I'm wondering then, because some people either they don't have access to computers, or even when they do get on to these sites, they just can't find anything about their families. Do you find that you can still work with ancestral patterns if you don't know your ancestral stories?
Yes, I mean, this was very much in the context of what came out of the group. There were some people there who had quite a good knowledge of what was going on from sort of bits of family history that they'd been taught and so forth, and others didn't. But even if you are adopted, and this is just one of the things in respect of all of this, the adoptive parents will create an environmental dynamic which you have to learn to deal with. But you will also have your ancestral patterns. And even if you don't know who your mother and father were, something of their energy is still working within you. So what you need to do is find ways, how can I begin to understand all of this? Are there other ways that I can begin to connect in and be aware of this dynamic? What I encourage people to do within my book is to if you find you can't find anything directly, is then work with different symbols to represent what your ancestors might be. So there's different systems of like thinking of medicine cards, or they talk about angel cards and so forth. And what you can do is you could begin to set up a sort of reading, which you can look at each ancestor in turn. So I can think, first of all, I'm going to do a reading, some form of reading for my father, and then I'm going to do a sort of reading for my mother, and you begin to build up a picture. And when you work with these sorts of I call them divinatory systems, but there's a vast array of them all. I mean, whether you want to do the tarot or the runes, I mean, it doesn't matter which one, but you can select ancestors in turn, and you can, and particularly from my point of view, the ones which are most significant are the parents, the grandparents, and the great-grandparents, which makes a total of 14 ancestors. So they're the most important. That's not to say others don't go further back, but they are the most important. And so you could build up a chart or a picture which looks at those 14 ancestors, and you could begin to then get insights into it. And when I'm running, one of the training groups, which I do, I've got other ways which you can begin to just connect in. Sometimes what we do is I get people to come together in threes. So not only are you working on your own ancestor, but you get the support of two other people to help you connect into that ancestor, to bring, whether there's a sense of healing or balance or just acknowledgement to that ancestor. So there are ways, Lisa, that even if we haven't actually got clear information about an ancestor, that you can begin to understand something of the patterns that sit behind there. And in that, within those 14 ancestors, you can often find an ancestor will come forward to help support the whole process. And it raises, I won't go on, it raises other issues, of course, to think, where are the ancestors? Are they energies within us, or are we connecting to them as they were? at that time? And if so, how do we understand that in the context of linear time? After all, my ancestors were all practically all deceased. So how do I understand that? And at one level, I approach it on the basis to say that there's some element of the ancestors that's still present with us in a sort of current form. So although they might have died 100 years, 200, 300 years ago, something of their pattern of energy is still linked into us. And that consciousness we can still interact with as though they was still alive and going through what their issues are. So in that way, one can begin to clear up and free up trauma, really, because in a sense, what one's trying to do is to heal some of the patterns which they've carried down to us.
Right. Now, I've got two questions. I want to hear more about your group work, the group dynamic when you're working on ancestral healing. But I also want to go back to what you were just saying about how where they actually are and how they're affecting us, because sometimes they're perfectly fine and they're actually sort of helping spirits, and other times they're not so they're not so healed and they're sort of messing with our lives. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Let's just pick up all of that. I mean, one of the issues which goes on, we are souls, from my perspective, which incarnate fully into a physical body. So, and I believe that we actually choose our lives. So I don't think it's random. There's a spiritual choice made before we come into incarnation. We choose to be born into a particular life, and that life forms the pattern of where we are. Now, when we come to the end of our life, we should vacate the physical body, and then to journey back into the spiritual world. And the near-death experience, which I'm sure you've come across, really describes what happens. Unfortunately, sometimes because of issues and problems, souls can get stuck. They become effectively earthbound, and they don't make a proper transition back into the spiritual world. So they can become, because they're earthbound, that can sometimes have a direct impact in a way upon us. So in the sense of something of their presence, which can still influence. And I'll give you an example of this in my own case. I told you my father was, we do not know, we knew who his mother was, but we didn't know who his father was. But I'm pretty certain his father died in the First World War, and was somehow still stuck in the trauma of all of that. My father was adopted. So although he knew who his mother was, or we know who his mother was, he didn't really know his mother. He only knew his adoptive parents. And sadly, my grandmother, because of certain situations that she was in, became institutionalized in an asylum. So she didn't die until 1963, and I could have known her, but of course this is part of the sort of some of the toxic secrets which are never brought out or never looked at or considered. Certainly my parents didn't want to talk about anything to do with their background except what they felt I should know. And so part of it was discovering things to do with my grandmother and so forth. Well, when I started to work directly with both my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side, they were both, I felt, stuck. And so I had to communicate with them at a spiritual level, to talk to them and to bring them together. And actually that created an incredible release of energies. So they had been split up and were carrying the trauma of the split because of circumstances. And I still haven't quite unraveled that, but nevertheless, in beginning to bring them together and release them and to help them transition fully back into the spiritual world. had quite a profound impact, not only in what I felt happened within me, but also on what happened to my father, because he very much didn't want to know what was going on this side. And yet he quite dramatically changed when I'd carried out this work. And he was quite an introverted individual in his own way. And suddenly after doing this, he became much more outgoing and wanting to connect with people from the past and so forth. So something of that pattern was obviously impacting upon him, and actually releasing that energy made quite a profound impact upon him. So that's one level that the ancestors can impact upon us. But if there's some deep-seated trauma or issues, some of that can go on tracking down, and as I said, it becomes woven within us. And I would always deal with it on the basis that if I feel there's a trauma in a great-grandparent, or going further back sometimes, because sometimes you get these patterns track on right back through the family, I will always try to communicate with the people at the level that I sense they're real individuals. Even if I do not have a picture of them or anything, you can still hold a sense that this is who I'm connecting to, and begin to release something of that energy. So it's listening to what I'm experiencing, what I'm feeling within me, and if I'm working with clients, what they're feeling within themselves. So I have one client I'm working with a lot at the moment, where he's got a huge family tree, but it's providing a real metaphor for him on healing certain things which are going on with him, and recognizing parts of him that are stuck, are probably because there was a stuckness which was going on in some ancestral energy further back. When we discover that, we will work with that to begin to clear it and free it up. And you can learn how to pick up these energies, these resonances, and experience them, and then begin to release them.
Right,
is that clear?
It is, but of course it just leads to a thousand more questions.
I know. There's the trouble in this field.
Well, so let's go ahead and let's talk about your work with groups, because I know that you can work with groups to heal specific family ancestors, but you're also working with them to heal ancestral patterns within a nation state.
Yeah, I mean, the different people have taken on these ideas from different countries, and in that particular case, the two countries which spring to mind where I know groups have come together, one is in Ireland, and the other is in Estonia. But in those cases, what you begin to take on board is think, okay, what's the inherent pattern which is sat here, which is not just mine, in a sense of my parents and grandparents, great-grandparents, but within the collective. What's the patterns of energy that we can begin to look at to begin to heal within the collective? And if you think about Ireland, Ireland went through terrible famine back in the 1800s, which led to a great diaspora of individuals, leaving the country. And there's an incredible amount of trauma that's been woven into the whole dynamic and energy of the place. So even if you don't know about specific ancestors that could have been caught up in that, there was a sense of what can be done to heal and clear these patterns. One of the books which is just worth mentioning on all of this, which was quite informative from my point of view, was a book called Healing Your Family Tree by Dr. Kenneth McCall. He had lived in China, so this is where the whole sense of importance of the ancestors, because if you think of different cultures, some of them really spend time connecting with their ancestors, revering them, going to their ancestors' graves and so forth. So he had something of that background, and when he came back to the UK, and he comes at this from quite a Christian perspective, he started to think about the way in which trauma from the ancestors could be impacting upon his patients. And to give you one little example which stands out for me as a story, was a priest came to see him, very concerned because her daughter had been committed into an asylum because she had an overwhelming desire to want to gouge out her children's eyes. And of course, this is, it's pretty heavy duty stuff in a way. And they were so concerned about this energy that they had her committed. So Kenneth McCall and this vicar, this priest, spent time doing some research into the family background, and discovered that somewhere in his family tree he had an ancestor that was connected with a castle. And when they did some further research into the castle, they found there were implements of torture for gouging out people's eyes. So there was a whole sense that maybe there was some ancestor that was stuck. Now, he approached this question of healing from a very Christian perspective. But what they did is they had a whole service of forgiveness carried out within the church. And the power of that was such to release this ancestor, whatever. But the power of that was such that at the moment that was carried out, even though the daughter was completely unaware of what was going on, and she was 200 miles away, she felt the whole compulsion just lift from her. Wow. And she also, in the family, there was an aunt who was schizophrenic. And again, at that same point, all of the schizophrenia left the aunt. So what we could surmise from all of that is possibly something of the soul of that ancestor which had carried out those deeds was so stuck that the only way he could communicate was by keep presenting this dynamic that he was caught up in a way as a cry for help. But being able to discover that and release him actually brought about this transformation. Now, I'm not saying that ancestral healing is so potent in all cases, but it does give you a sense of how these patterns can track on down through families, and how you can need to spend sometimes time to try to feel back in if there's an inherent problem that's coming up, to think maybe this problem is because in the daughter's case, she was probably quite psychic and was picking up something of this energy. So it wasn't truly coming from within her, but something that she was carrying as part of this, family tree pattern.
Wow,
so,
yeah. Well, now, is this where your spirit release work comes in? Because I can sort of feel into what you're talking about, where this is just this pattern that's just sort of reverberating throughout, your energy field and into your psyche, and you're not even aware that this isn't you wanting to do these things. It's somebody who's just sort of stuck in this horror.
Yeah.
So is that where your spirit release work comes
Yes,
in?
very much so. In one way, another area that's probably been the primary focus of my work for the past 20 years, I guess, has been trying to understand the interlinking between spirit entities, souls that perhaps are stuck, and how they impact upon us, and what can be done to help release those issues and problems. And it's a huge area. I mean, it's deeply fascinating. It's frustrating at times because sometimes working with clients who there's a real feeling that there's some trauma, but you can't quite yet get to the core of the trauma. But nevertheless, enormously rewarding when patterns which are stuck become freed up and released. And so one of the things which is hugely important now, and has become far more significant really in the work that I've gone on, and also in relationship to the ancestral healing, is recognizing that we all have a part of our psyche. There's two crucial parts of our psyche. One is the sort of core self part, if you like, the soul essence which exists within us, or the self, whatever term you want to do it. And another part of us which is anchored in the spiritual world, which you could call our higher self. So we tend to think of ourselves as being you know, this is just me. And if you're thinking in terms of past lives, you go back into the spiritual world and the same bit comes back again. But actually, I don't see it like that anymore. I rather see, using a wonderful analogy of cakes, I like to see our spirit as like the great cake in the sky. What happens in any lifetime, you take a slice of the cake and put it into the physical body. And then when we go back into the spiritual world, we reunite with the cake and all of the elements that we need as being part of all of that get reintegrated back in. But there is a link to that spiritual part, which is, if you like, have the overview of our life, which I would call the higher self. And so part of it is teaching people how to connect to that part, because that part has a complete awareness of all of your journey, but also can be aware that if there's ancestral patterns or there's past life patterns, what needs to be done to help resolve them, or if there's spirit attachments and so forth. And one of the difficulties is in the environmental sense, when we grow up, if we hit trauma or exposed to a lot of trauma as a child, then parts of us get split off, and these parts can be susceptible then to different types of spirit influence. So it's how you can begin to heal. Our inner world is incredibly complex, Lisa. So I used to think at one time when someone came and sat in front of me, oh, there's just one individual there. I can see them and talk to them and so forth. Now, actually, when anyone comes in, I think, oh, there's a whole gang here. So we're going to have to think about how do we work with this this whole group of people. And of course, when you think of the ancestors, it's a fascinating journey when we look at the whole history of what's gone on of humanity on this planet, and the numbers become actually immense. You think we got 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, that's making 14. You don't have to go back too far, maybe about 33, 34 generations, and you actually get numbers which are bigger than the world population. Now think about that, more than 8 billion ancestors. Now, of course, there are not 8 billion people living on the planet in 1066 or whatever date it is. And what that indicates is we're all interconnected, we're all related. So it's similar patterns which are running down through whole groups, and this is what becomes significant about groups within in nation states. Perhaps not so much in America, although you've got the whole issue to do with the first people in states, all the trauma that's gone on in relationship to that, how that impacts back against the land and the place. So all of that needs to be understood. But we're all connected back to an original Eve that lived somewhere in Africa, probably about 150,000 years ago. So and we used to think at one time that we had no Neanderthal DNA within us. But of course, with all the wonders of DNA research, now we know that there was some level of interbreeding took place between human beings and Neanderthals, and quite a lot, particularly in the European population, carry that connection. So we're just amazingly complex beings, but there's all of these patterns which we need to try to understand, and the ancestral one is a hugely important one. So it's honoring the ancestors, acknowledging them. I mean, the 2 things that they need above all else seem to come out. One is forgiveness, so anything that they've caused, anything issue to be, and secondly to be acknowledged, really. And the acknowledgement we sort of tended to forget, don't we? I mean, how often do we think about going to the graves of our ancestors and looking at them and connecting to them and doing that? And that's all been part of my journey. I mean, I've spent time not only for myself, going and discovering, graves, clearing them up from grandparents, great grandparents.
Yeah, it can be a very moving experience. I've done the same for the grave sites that I can actually find. I've traveled all over and tried to do the same, and it really is it's a very profound feeling when you're actually standing on the grave of your great grandparents.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah, and it's there's some programs they run on British TV called "Who Do You Think You Are," which they take famous stars and take them back through their ancestry, and it's very, very powerful, very moving.
Right.
when they start to think back, oh gosh, this is part of my ancestry. This is part of my lineage. This individual, and what was going on, for my grandfather, that led him to one, set up his bookmaker business, which he did. I mean, it was all illegal. So I got a whole lot of rogues. I discovered another ancestor. Sad to relate. There's a whole side of my family on my mother's grandmother's side, going back to her ancestors, going back to 1830, where I think they were living in a very, very poor situation. And just before Christmas, he decides he's maybe the family's so hungry, he goes out and steals a sheep. And but of course, it was a bit stupid because there was frost on the ground, and they could track where when the farmer discovered in the morning one of his sheep was missing, he could just follow the tracks straight back to where my grandfather was living. He was arrested. He was put into prison and then sent on a convict ship to Australia, or to Van Diemen's Land, which is now modern Tasmania. And sad to relate, before the ship actually docked in harbour, it hit some rocks, and a lot of the people were drowned, of which he was one of them. But the impact of that on the family was cataclysmic. I mean, it broke up all the family. I think it caused a huge amount of problems for my great-grandmother. And something of that patterns came down into my grandmother. And so you can see how these traumas track on down through the family. My sense is, at least if I can go back and heal and release some of this trauma, then it will help my children. So part of it is not just from the point of view of what it does for me, but the sense of clearing it up from the point of view of subsequent generations, really.
Yeah. It feels like that's really our work when we're doing ancestral healing. It's not just to help ourselves, but it's for the future generations, which then of course ripples out to the entire world. If enough of us do this,
of course,
it clears a lot of patterns.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at the time here, and I want to make sure before we go any further in our conversation that I mention your websites, because there's so much information there. One of them is davidfurlong.co.uk, and then you've also got spiritrelease.org. So if people want to work with you, if they want to connect with you, which of these two sites do you suppose is better for them?
Well, either, but probably the davidfurlong.co.uk is the easiest one. And if someone is interested in following through on anything, do drop me an email and look to connect up. I'm quite busy, but I will respond and to see what comes up. And certainly my book, which I've got a copy of here, is available. And I had someone posted something recently, a colleague on a trauma site, where she mentioned the looking at childhood trauma, the impact of childhood trauma. But she mentioned very nicely that she found that my book was very helpful, because it includes quite a lot of exercises that people can do, self-help exercises which people can do. And she said she's found a lot of the insights in there would be very valuable in working through some of her clients through regression. So it's really spreading the idea. I mean, and the need for us. I mean, when I wrote my book, as I told you, there was Kenneth McCall's book, Healing Your Family Tree, but there was practically no other book about ancestry. But it is becoming more popular. And there are another way of working with the ancestors is through psychodynamic patterning, where groups will come together and act out the roles of different ancestors, and that's another way of approaching it all. So it is, the awareness is there, and it is important, I think, for for all of us at some level to be conscious and aware of the importance of our ancestors and how we're carrying their patterns. Certainly now science validates this through epigenetics, and begun to recognize, in fact, that we do carry patterns. Again, when I wrote my book, it was regarded that DNA was the bottom line. We don't carry these patterns down to us, and yet my guidance and intuition said that's rubbish. Science is going to discover it, and of course, early part of the 2000, they started to make these discoveries that, in fact, there's a whole other level of the way in which patterns from our ancestors impact upon us. And if there's been trauma there, it can influence the development of the current life. So it's a hugely important area, hugely fascinating, and one which I'd encourage, certainly all of the people who are listening in to your summit to really begin to look at. And just begin to think about, can I get some information? Can I look and see who my parents are, who my grandparents were, who my great-grandparents were, just to begin to build a picture up.
Right. Yeah, that's the best way to start, is just start digging into the stories, and you begin to recognize, wait a minute, oh, that's something that I do, and I didn't realize that there was anybody before me who did the same thing. So yeah, wow. Thank you so much for being with us today, David, and for sharing all that you've shared. This has been a really fascinating conversation. So thank you for calling in all the way from England. We appreciate your time.
No, you're welcome. It's a delight to be able to share these things. They're obviously dear to my heart. And so I get a great, pleasure really being able to share things that have sort of fired me up, if you like. And also as an acknowledgement to all the wonderful support and energy that's come down to me from my ancestors. So I value that hugely. And it's all part of healing, isn't it, of what's going on the planet. And it needs quite a bit of healing at this moment in time.
Yep, that's what the work is all about. Wow. Once again, thank you, David Furlong, and thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this conversation in the Ancestral Healing Summit.
Thank you for joining the Ancestral Healing Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit ancestralhealingsummit.com. To learn more about our global programs to support you in waking up in all the areas of your life and taking inspired action, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing this empowering path of healing your lineages with your friends and family.